Hi, folks. Welcome back. Here we are with our next lecture. I'm your instructor, Professor Abundes Guerra. And last time, right? Last time we talked about the Metcalfe piece in general, sort of like an introduction to philosophy, what it even is. We talked about what philosophy even is. Today we're going to get into one of my favorite pieces, which is the Rachel's piece, The Challenge of Cultural Relativism. Now, a few of you mentioned online, particularly for a discussion post, because I confused the terms cultural relativism with moral relativism. I confused them. Technically speaking, as we're going to see, cultural relativism is going to be a type of moral relativism. I probably should have made that a little clear in the discussion post, so sorry for any confusion that I may have caused. But with that said, let's go ahead and start up by looking at the Rachel's piece. So let me go ahead and start up these slides. Let me move my head. So this is Rachel's. The name of his article is called The Challenge of Cultural Relativism. In order to understand what cultural relativism is, we need to first understand what it is not. It is not moral realism or moral objectivism. Moral realism or moral objectivism is the idea that there is one set of moral standards that applies across the board to every human being. So if one action is morally wrong, such as murder or lying, it is wrong for all people, all folk, of all cultures, times, and places. If it's wrong for me to murder someone in cold blood, it's wrong for someone across the world, either 500 years in the future or 500 years in the past, to do the same thing. You might like moral realism or moral objectivism because, in a certain sense, it is fair. It doesn't really allow for any double standards. People, a lot of the times, don't like double standards. Maybe you don't. Now, moral relativism is just going to say that moral realism is false. There really is no moral right or wrong, just right or wrong according to someone or something. And here's where we get two different types of moral relativism. The one that we're going to be concerned about, that Rachel's going to be talking about, is cultural relativism, in which right and wrong is decided by each culture and society. So what is wrong in one culture might be right in another. Now, Rachel's himself gives some examples about the Galatians and the Greeks and their cultural practices of burning the dead and eating the dead, and how, depending on which culture you're talking to, some of those practices might be morally right or morally wrong. But again, it's to each culture. Subjectivism is, in a sense, a little more intense. It's also a type of moral relativism. It says that right and wrong is decided by each individual person. So what is wrong to one person might be right to another. But again, it's not about each culture. It's about each individual person in that culture, each individual person in the world decides their own personal subjective right and wrong. So at this point, so subjectivism is pretty intense, but put that to the side. Maybe you are a subjectivist, and that's fine, but we're not going to consider that right now. Just know that a lot of things we can say, and that we are going to say about cultural relativism might apply to subjectivism as well. But I'll leave that for you as personal homework. Still, why should we accept cultural relativism according to Rachel's? Or why might cultural relativism be attractive according to Rachel's? Well, there's a few reasons, and they kind of overlap into each other. The first one is that we don't want to be seen as meddlesome. America and European Americans, we have a pretty bad history here of, not minding our own business, whether that's, with imperialism, colonialism, enslavement, a bunch of bad things that Western powers, Western nations have done throughout the centuries. And if you are not accepting cultural relativism and saying, oh, that's right and wrong according to you, but if you reject the idea and say, no, right and wrong, my right and wrong, I'm going to impose it onto you, you might be seen as interfering and continuing to partake in these legacies of imperialism, colonialism, so on and so on. It might be seen as not minding your own business. The second one is, and again, this overlaps with the first one, you don't want to be seen as intolerant, uncultured, unrefined, or impolite. So this is basically the idea that you don't want to seem essentially dumb. You don't want to seem stupid and dumb. You want to seem uncultured in the ways of the world. Think of it like this, right? Suppose that in my culture, it is respectful to look at your teacher in the eyes when you're speaking to them. But I'm talking to a student, and that student's culture, it's impolite to look at a teacher in the eyes when you talk to them. In fact, the way you show respect to a teacher is by looking down. So that student comes up to me and they look down, and I think they're being disrespectful. And then I go and talk to my coworkers and I say, "Oh, that student, they're so rude and defiant. They didn't even look me in the eye. Can you imagine the disrespect?" Now, at that point, my coworkers might rightly say, "Victor, you're being dumb and uncultured and unrefined and also impolite. That person, that student, is trying to show you respect in their own way. You are just too small brained to see that." So that's another reason why you might want to err on the side of cultural relativism and say, "Oh, well, maybe that's just right or wrong according to their culture, and I shouldn't take it personally." And the third one, right? And this, again, this overlaps with the first and second one. You don't want to be seen as contemptful of other folks and other practices and other cultures. If you say that, right and wrong is decided by my culture and other people should accept my version of right and wrong according to my culture, then what you're essentially saying is that other cultures have it wrong, that they're worse off, that they're, in a sense, more barbaric, more savage, more morally corrupt, or more morally wrong, one of those things. And by saying that, you could come off as racist or discriminatory. You could come off that way, and you might even straight up be racist or discriminatory when saying those things. You might be seen as intolerant. So those are the reasons, according to Rachel's, why you might want to accept cultural relativism. However, ultimately, he's going to say that we should reject it, Rachel's. So he does a little bit of a switcheroo. He says, it might look attractive because of XYZ, but ultimately, don't do it. Don't accept cultural relativism. And he gives a few reasons why. The first one is, look, just because different moral codes among cultures exist doesn't mean that there's no objective moral truth. So he uses an analogy here, right? Go back hundreds of years when different cultures and different societies had different maps and geographies of the world. They had different, they had different maps, right? They had different cartographies of the world, I guess you could say. But that doesn't mean that every single map was just as good as the other map. Just different cultures came up with different maps. But now that we have, satellite pictures of the world, we know that some of those maps might be more or less accurate. Similarly, morality might be like that. Some cultures have different moral maps, but that doesn't mean that in the future, once we have more of morality actually mapped out, that all of these moral maps right now in the present are just as good. Some of them might be more accurate than others. And here's really, so that's one argument, right? It's an argument from analogy. Morality might be like geography. The second one, and this is really the biggest argument, and it's going to have different parts to it, is that if we accept cultural relativism, it's going to lead to really bad consequences, he says. So, the first one is that we're not going to have any warrant to criticize other cultures. And we definitely cannot intervene in other cultures. Because again, why should you intervene in other cultures? Just because you personally think it's wrong with your personal culture, what another culture is doing, well, it's right to them. So you need to mind your own business. You need to mind your own culture if you accept cultural relativism. Now, this might seem benign when maybe it comes to maybe food. Some people get pretty passionate about food, and I'm not saying that's wrong. And it might seem pretty benign when it comes to maybe ways of speaking or maybe even fashion, right? Clothes. So it might be seem, yeah, maybe that's what you should do. But what about other more intense practices, which seem to be bad, morally wrong? So he gives the example of female genital mutilation, which goes against, a lot of the times, goes against the consent of girls because it's done when they are recently born or at a very young age. That seems to be bad. But if we accept cultural relativism, we don't really have a warrant or grounding to criticize that at all. The second one, right? The second bad consequence is that it's not that we can't even criticize other cultures. We can't even criticize our own culture, our own society. So most of us probably think that the United States could be better in some ways, right? Maybe you think it could be more conservative, more liberal, more progressive. Maybe you think it could be more religious. Maybe you think it could be less religious. But chances are everyone here listening to this thinks that the United States could be better in some way. Or if not the United States, your personal society could be better in some ways. You probably think so. But if we accept cultural relativism, you need to shut up, right? Because what's right and wrong is not decided by you individually. Again, this is not subjectivism. It's decided by the culture. It's decided by the majority. So you have no warrant to criticize and try to improve your own culture. It's not up to you. It's up to the culture at large. Third, and this is kind of, I think, one of the biggest arguments or biggest reasons or biggest bad consequences, according to Rachel's, is that it denies moral progress. Remember, cultural relativism says that any one culture is not better or worse than another culture across space. They also says that cultures are not better across time. So just look at the same space right now. Let's look at the United States, the same space, but across different times. So let's look at the culture of the United States 500 or 300 to 400 years ago and the culture of the United States right now. We would be forced to say that the United States right now is not morally superior or morally better than the United States in the early 1800s. So about, 223 years ago. That's not better than that culture in the 1800s when enslavement was legal and women could not vote and were treated as second-class citizens. We would have to say that's not morally bad. That was just different. Now, again, we could still say, oh, it was a different time. Sure, you could say it was a different time. But if we accept cultural relativism, we would have to say it was a different time, and that time is no better or worse than right now. It's just as valid. And that sounds kind of iffy. If you're willing to bite the bullet on that and say that, our society with enslavement is not better than our society right now without enslavement, that's going to be a hard pill to swallow. But if we accept cultural relativism, we are somewhat committed to that claim. So his conclusion is that we should ultimately reject cultural relativism. The alternative, he says, is that we still don't want to be seen as intolerant or racist or discriminatory, of course. So he says this: we may ask whether the cultural practice, promotes or hinders the welfare of the people whose lives are affected by it. This is what he calls the principle of non-maleficence, the principle of no bad or not doing bad. If you know Latin or a Romance language like Spanish, no hacer mal, no mal. It's in the word. It's in the root. So if that practice does do, if it does hinder the welfare of the people whose lives are affected by it, then we should criticize that practice. And in extreme examples, maybe we should even intervene. But if not, if it doesn't actually hinder the welfare of the people whose lives are affected by it, then we should tolerate it because, again, we don't want to be racist or discriminatory. Oh, and for some reason, it's repeating the slide. Apologies if you can hear the lawnmower outside. Someone decided to mow the lawn today. So here's the takeaway. We'll be discussing a lot about morality in this class, and disagreement is encouraged. We will, of course, be polite. We're not going to attack the person themselves or insist that others debate you. No one owes you a debate. But you will not be able to hide behind the idea of, well, that's just my opinion, man or woman or person, so respect it. Because ultimately that is going to prematurely shut down a fruitful conversation. If you don't want to talk or argue, that's fine. But you are, in a sense, forfeiting your right to have people who might agree or disagree with you. You're forfeiting the privilege of people listening to you. Yes, all folks are entitled to an opinion. And some opinions in this class will be better than others. And that's not going to be decided whether you're more religious or less religious, more conservative or less conservative, more progressive and socialist or not, whatever. It's going to be decided by how well you argue your points with evidence, reasons, anecdotes, and facts. And we'll get more on that once we get to the papers for the class, in which I will give you rubrics, of course. But again, the takeaway is that I encourage you to disagree. And maybe you are a cultural relativist or a subjectivist, that's fine. But I encourage you not to adopt the cultural relativist or the subjectivist line of, that's just my opinion, so let's not talk. Because you're going to get a lot less of this class if you do say that. If you do go with that mentality. Okay, folks. That's it for this lecture. I'll see you folks next time. Bye-bye.